Hey y'all. Um, our devotion for today is talking a little bit about God's sovereignty. So there's a lot of bad things going on right now. People are out of jobs. People are getting sick. People are dying. We're isolated from one another. It just seems really, really awful. And it is. It truly is. And I think not the only thing to remember right now, but possibly the most important thing to remember right now in the midst of this pandemic is that God is sovereign. What does sovereignty mean? That might not be a word that you use very often, but sovereignty, when you do use it, talks a lot about kingship, that a king has power and control over his kingdom. Well, God is the ultimate king, and God has ultimate control over his kingdom, namely everything that he created, which is everything that exists. That God has control over all things. Over and over and over again in the Bible, we see that God has a purpose, God has a plan, and all things that happen work out to accomplish the plan that he set forth. It's like an author of a story. Everything works together to accomplish the story that God, the author, is telling. And that may be hard to stomach, especially when we're in the midst of hard times, of difficult times, of sad times, scary times, the ones like we're experiencing right now. And, as I was thinking about it, I thought about what's the worst thing to ever happen on planet Earth? And I think the answer from the Bible, you may not believe this, but the worst thing to happen is the death of the Son of God. Is when Jesus himself came to us, the Creator, the good person, the only truly good person came to us. And what did we do? How did we respond? We rejected him and we killed him. And even in the midst of that darkness, it still works to accomplish God's plan. So, I wanted us to look at Acts 2, starting in verse 22. It says, Men of Israel, hear these words: Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know. A man who was powerful, a man who was sent by God, a man who was working, a man that was clearly different from everybody else. This Jesus, delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men. What could be worse than Jesus, the Son of God, the perfect human, God in the flesh, being delivered over and crucified at the hands of lawless men? And yet it says that this was according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God. That God had a plan, he knew this was going to happen, and he used it for good. So, what are a few things that we can take from this? First of all, just because God is in control doesn't mean we shrug our shoulders and we go about our lives like normal right now, and we ignore doctors, we ignore the CDC, we just kind of say, God's going to take care of me no matter what. That's fatalism. That's just saying, regardless of my actions, things are going to go well for me. Well, that's not what this says. It says that these humans, these people who crucified Jesus, were accountable for it. They were crucified, and he was crucified and killed at the hands of lawless men. Men who will be held accountable for their lawlessness, for their disobedience, for their unrighteousness. That we all have a personal responsibility. Just because God is taking care of us and protecting us doesn't mean that we just, operate as though life is no different. We have to regard the wisdom of doctors. The other thing that I think that it teaches us is we don't just shrug our shoulders and say, "Oh, this is no big deal. We just need to move past this." The Bible has a huge category for grief and sadness. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. Even though we know this is God's plan, there's still plenty of space for us to be sad about it, for us to grieve about it. I think the biggest thing that we take away from this passage that we see here is hope. that because God is in control of all things, and because God is good to those who belong to Him, that we can have hope that He is working out all things for our good. You know, this is the darkest thing that happened ever in the history of our planet was Jesus being crucified by His own creation. As dark and as sad as that is, it also was the very thing that brought salvation and rescue to all humanity. So even though things are dark and bad and awful and scary, God is good. And because He's in control, we can have hope, a confidence that God will use all these things, even though we don't understand it now, and we may never understand it in this life, that He's going to use all things for our good to draw us closer to Him. So um, that's the thought for today. When you get anxious, when you get scared, when you get hopeless, remember that God is in control of all things and He cares for you.